A blistering sun beats down on a forgotten corner of America. One man, broken by time but not by will, waits in silence, stranded, disrespected, and ignored. But when someone sees more than just the wrinkles, everything changes. The sun hung high over the flat expanse of asphalt, casting long shadows and turning the air into a shimmering haze. Brandon McCoy pulled his rig into the freight depot with the kind of precision that only decades on the road could teach. His truck, a battered, dust-covered beast of steel, groaned as he brought it to a stop, its frame protesting after 600 miles of relentless driving. Inside the cab, the heat was oppressive, the dashboard cracked from years of sun exposure and use. Brandon wiped a sleeve across his forehead, squinting against the glare. He wasn't here for comfort or rest. He was here because lives depended on what he carried in the trailer behind him. Medical supplies, urgently needed by a rural hospital teetering on the edge of disaster. The nurses had begged for faster delivery. Brandon had obliged. No sleep, no breaks. Just steady pressure on the pedal and a 1,000-yard stare out the windshield. But as he stepped down from the cab, boots hitting the pavement like hammer strikes, the world didn't greet him with urgency or gratitude. Instead, Kyle Winger stood waiting, clipboard in hand, expression sharp and unyielding. Brandon McCoy? Kyle's voice was crisp, official. Too young, too sure of himself. Brandon gave a slow nod. That's me. Kyle scanned the paperwork. You're missing Form 14B. I can't clear your load without it. Brandon blinked, the words not immediately registering. Form what? 14B, Kyle repeated, as if speaking to a child. New regulation. Brandon's jaw tightened. No one ever mentioned that form before. I don't make the rules, Kyle said coolly. I just enforce them. Even with years of experience, it was a situation he didn't have much control over. A different document, one that had never been requested before. Brandon scratched his head thinking about how he would resolve this. Around them, the depot buzzed with life. Trucks came and went, engines growled, forklifts hummed. But Brandon stood still, stranded under the brutal sun, sweat already soaking through his shirt. He glanced at the other rigs rolling through the inspection line without issue, their drivers barely slowing down. Inside the depot, workers moved in and out of the office, eyeing him with curiosity, and something else, disrespect. One man, sleeves rolled up and arms crossed, leaned against the doorway and smirked. Guys like him should have retired years ago, he muttered loud enough to be heard. Brandon ignored him. Words were wind. Action was everything. But as he waited, frustration gnawed at him. Not because of the delay, but his memories. Afghanistan, the sandstorms that turned night into day, the screams over the radio, the weight of knowing that every minute mattered, that every second lost meant someone didn't make it. He pushed those thoughts down. Couldn't afford to go there now. Then came the sound of cursing. A younger driver, Martin Terrence, judging by the name stitched into his jacket, was crouched beside a tire, hands coated in dirt, trying to wrestle a stubborn lug nut free. Brandon watched for a moment, then walked over. You're tightening it, he said simply. Martin looked up, startled. What? That wrench? You're turning it the wrong way. Martin hesitated, then checked. Sure enough, he was making it worse. He groaned, wiping sweat from his brow. Man, I'm so done with this job. Brandon knelt beside him, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small tool. Hold the nut steady here, he instructed. With practiced ease, he loosened the bolt using a field trick he'd learned in the army. Something about leverage, patience, and knowing when to push and when to yield. Within minutes, the tire was off, replaced with a spare. Martin stared at him, amazed. Thanks, man, he said. Where'd you learn that? Brandon stood, brushing dust from his knees. Long time ago. Martin offered a tired smile. Well, you just saved my ass. Brandon didn't respond. He just nodded once and walked back toward his rig, where Kyle still waited, arms crossed, expression unchanged. Time dragged on. The sun beat down, and somewhere deep inside, the old soldier stirred, wondering how many more battles he had left in him. The sun had climbed higher, turning the asphalt into a frying pan. Sweat soaked through Brandon's shirt, clinging to his skin like a second layer he couldn't shed. The heat pressed down on him, thick and unrelenting, but it wasn't just the temperature that made his body feel heavy, and time itself. Hours had passed. He sat on the bumper of his rig, boots planted in the dust, eyes fixed on nothing. Around him, the world moved, drivers came and went, forklifts hummed, voices rose and fell in a steady rhythm of commerce. But Brandon remained still, caught in the slow drag of memory. He could hear it again, the crackle of static over the radio, the distant shouts from men who knew they were running out of time. Afghanistan. A supply convoy stuck in enemy territory. No backup, no air support. Just him, a broken truck, and a decision that changed everything. He remembered the weight of responsibility, how every second mattered, how lives hinged on whether or not he got them out in time. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. Those memories weren't supposed to come back. Not like this. Then footsteps approached, deliberate, measured. Brandon didn't look up. McCoy. The voice was familiar. Not recent, but old. Like something dredged up from a past he'd tried to bury. Brandon lifted his head slowly. Standing before him was a man in a crisp suit, though the heat had already started to loosen his collar. His face was older now, lined with years, but there was no mistaking the sharp jawline, the military posture, the way he carried himself like someone used to command. Robert Graves. Brandon blinked once, then stood. Didn't think I'd see you again. Graves gave a small, tight smile. Didn't think I'd find you waiting in the sun like some forgotten relic. Kyle Winger stepped forward, clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. Sir, I wasn't aware. You weren't, Graves said, cutting him off without looking away from Brandon. Because if you did, you wouldn't be standing here wasting his time. I'm following protocol, Kyle insisted, his voice rising slightly. Graves turned to him fully. You want to talk about protocol? You know who this is. Kyle hesitated. No. This is Sergeant Brandon McCoy, Graves said, voice low but edged like steel. The man who kept an entire battalion alive when half their convoy was blown to hell. No maps, no fuel, no backup, just instinct and scrap parts. He drove straight through an ambush zone because he knew what would happen if he didn't. He saved lives. Dozens of them. Silence settled between them like dust after a storm. Kyle swallowed hard. I didn't know. No, Graves said, shaking his head. That's the problem, isn't it? He turned back to Brandon, expression softening slightly. This ends now. With a flick of his pen, Graves signed off on the inspection report, bypassing the missing Form 14B entirely. Then he handed it back to Kyle, who took it without a word. Brandon exhaled, slow and deep. He didn't thank Graves, didn't offer a handshake, just nodded once, a silent acknowledgement between men who understood each other without needing words. He reached for his paperwork, tucking it under one arm. Appreciate the help, he muttered. Graves crossed his arms. You still driving? Brandon looked toward the horizon, where the road stretched endlessly ahead. Yeah, he said. Always. As he walked back toward the cab, something shifted inside him. Not relief, not pride, but something close. And someone had finally seen him. Not just the aging trucker sweating in the sun, but the man beneath the uniform, the medals, the silence. And maybe that meant something after all. A few feet away, Martin Terrence watched the exchange unfold from the shade of a loading bay. He hadn't heard everything, but he saw enough. The way Kyle's confidence crumbled, the way the stranger in the suit spoke with quiet authority, the way Brandon reacted like a man who'd spent decades trying to forget something important. Martin stepped forward, hesitant. Hey, Mr. McCoy. Brandon stopped, glancing over his shoulder. I don't know what just happened, Martin admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. But that guy, he talked about you like you were some kind of legend. Brandon snorted softly. Legends don't exist anymore. Just survivors. Martin frowned. Still, thanks for helping me earlier. I mean, really, I was about ready to quit. Brandon studied him for a long moment, Trucking ain't easy. It breaks people. Yeah, Martin said, voice low. Feels like it's breaking me. Brandon shook his head. No, you're just tired. There's a difference. Martin opened his mouth to say something else, but the older man was already walking away. Inside the depot, Kyle stared at the signed document in his hands. He felt hollow, as if the rules he'd held so tightly to had suddenly lost meaning. He glanced at Graves, who was watching Brandon go. Was all that true? Kyle asked quietly. Graves turned to him. Every word. Kyle looked down. I should have checked his ID sooner. Graves gave a dry chuckle. Maybe. Or you should have treated everyone like they mattered until proven otherwise. Without another word, Graves turned and walked away, leaving Kyle alone with the weight of a lesson he hadn't been prepared for. Outside, Brandon climbed into the cab of his truck. He let the engine rumble to life, feeling the vibration in his bones. The AC wheezed weakly, barely pushing cold air, but it was enough. He shifted into gear and pulled forward, tires crunching against gravel. Behind him, the depot faded into the distance. Ahead, the road called him forward. And somewhere deep inside, the soldier stirred once more. No longer forgotten, no longer unseen. Morning came with a cool breeze that barely touched the still warm asphalt of the depot. The sun hadn't fully risen, but already the place buzzed with movement. Engines revving, forklifts clanking, voices rising and falling in a rhythm as old as the road itself. Inside the break room, Martin Terrence sat at a chipped metal table, coffee in hand, telling the same story for the third time that morning. No, seriously, he said, leaning forward, eyes wide. This guy was just standing there, sweating through his shirt, and this federal auditor walks up like some kind of ghost from the past and says, "Do you even know who this is?" Across from him, a driver wearing an oil-stained jacket raised an eyebrow. What happened next? Martin grinned. Turns out, Brandon McCoy saved a whole damn battalion in Afghanistan. No maps, no backup, just instinct and scrap parts. Another man scoffed. You're making that up. I swear to God, Martin insisted. I saw it. Kyle looked like he was gonna puke. Laughter broke out around the table, but beneath it was something else. Respect. Curiosity. A shift. By noon, the story had spread beyond the break room. Drivers passing through the depot mentioned it over CB radio. Someone printed out a photo of Brandon's rig from the security feed and pinned it to the bulletin board with a note. McCoy, delivering more than cargo. Inside the office, Kyle Winger sat at his desk, staring at the blank form in front of him. He'd filled out hundreds like it, but today the lines felt heavier, the rules less absolute. He glanced out the window and saw an elderly driver struggling with a stack of paperwork, squinting at the fine print, muttering under his breath. Kyle stood without thinking. Outside, the older man fumbled with a clipboard, trying to keep pages from blowing away in the wind. Need help? Kyle asked. The driver looked up, surprised. Yeah, actually, I can't read half of this small print. Kyle took the clipboard gently. Let me go through it with you. For the first time since he started working here, Kyle didn't check the clock. Didn't rush, just helped. Out on the edge of the depot, near the fuel pumps, Brandon leaned against his rig, arms crossed, watching the world move around him. His truck was fueled, his load cleared, and yet he lingered. Behind him, footsteps approached, measured, familiar. Brandon didn't turn. Back again. Robert Graves stopped beside him, hands in his pockets. Got a few minutes? Brandon grunted. I got time. Graves studied him for a moment before speaking. I've got a position opening up. Logistics. Office-based. You'd be overseeing transport routes, training new drivers, cutting out the nonsense that held you up yesterday. Brandon raised an eyebrow. You offering me a desk job? A chance to make a difference off the road, Graves corrected. Brandon exhaled slowly. My war's over. Graves tilted his head slightly. Is it? Or are you still fighting in your own way? Brandon looked toward the horizon, where the highway stretched into the distance, winding through fields and dust and endless possibility. "I don't belong behind a desk," he said finally. "I belong on the road." Graves nodded once, not disappointed, just understanding. Then he placed a firm hand on Brandon's shoulder. "Maybe that's still your mission." Brandon gave the smallest of smiles. "Maybe." Without another word, Graves turned and walked away, disappearing into the bustle of the depot. Brandon climbed into the cab, settled into the worn seat, and fired up the engine. As he pulled onto the highway, the city faded behind him. Fields opened up, the sky widened, and the road became his alone. But somewhere ahead, a hospital waited. The GPS blinked with directions, but Brandon didn't need them. He knew where he was going. He'd seen the face in his mind during those long hours in the sun. The elderly patient lying in a hospital bed, gasping for breath, waiting for medicine that might never come. Now it would. He passed the exit sign, turned smoothly, and followed the road until the white walls of the hospital rose into view. Inside, nurses moved quickly, focused, efficient. A young woman in scrubs stepped out just as Brandon pulled up, clipboard in hand. "Delivery for emergency supplies," he called through the open window. She smiled. "Thank God. We were running dangerously low." Brandon handed her the manifest, watching as she scanned the list, nodding approvingly. "This is perfect," she said. "We have a patient who needs this exact dosage." "If this had been delayed," she trailed off, then looked at him curiously. "Did you bring this all the way yourself?" Brandon shrugged. "Just doing my job." She hesitated, then offered a warm smile. "Well, thank you." She turned and hurried inside, the door swinging shut behind her. Brandon watched her go, then looked toward the windows above. Somewhere in one of those rooms, a man was getting a second chance. And maybe so was he. Back at the depot, the change wasn't immediate, but it was real. Drivers talked differently now, with purpose, respect. Some even started referring to the freight yard as McCoy's stop, though no one had ever heard Brandon say anything about it. Kyle, meanwhile, found himself looking at every driver a little longer, listening a little harder. When an elderly woman struggled with her manifest later that week, he didn't hesitate. He stepped in, helped her fill out the forms, and made sure she got through inspection without delay. No one said anything, but she smiled, and that was enough. Somewhere down the road, Brandon drove on, the weight of the past still with him, but lighter now. Because sometimes, redemption didn't come with medals or parades. Sometimes it came with a single act of recognition. A name remembered, a road still calling, and a mission that never truly ended. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through fields and sky. Brandon McCoy sat behind the wheel, the familiar hum of the engine beneath him, the CB radio crackling softly with distant voices. Then came a voice he didn't expect. "Breaker, breaker. Anybody talking to Old Iron out there?" Brandon blinked. "Old Iron?" He glanced at the CB, then keyed the mic. "This is Old Iron. What's your 20? A chuckle came through. "Just wanted to say thanks, man. Heard about what you did back at the depot." Another voice joined in. "Yeah, brother. You stood up for all of us grinders out here. We owe you one." Brandon smirked faintly, shaking his head. He hadn't asked for a nickname, didn't want one, but it seemed the road had given it to him anyway. He let go of the mic and focused on the drive, but the chatter continued. Drivers hailed him by name now. Some told stories they'd heard, some exaggerated, some not. But all carried the same message: you matter. Back at the depot, change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the turning of pages in an old book. A new sign had been erected near the entrance, its letters freshly painted. "Here, we value those who carry more than cargo. They carry history." Kyle Winger stood near the doorway, watching the wind gently sway the sign back and forth. He ran a hand over his face, still trying to wrap his mind around everything that had happened. He remembered the look on Brandon's face when Graves had spoken his name like it meant something. The way Kyle had suddenly felt small, insignificant, even though he'd only been doing his job. Now he saw things differently. Later that day, a veteran driver pulled in, clearly exhausted, struggling to keep his eyes open. Without hesitation, Kyle walked over. "You good?" he asked. The older man gave a tired nod. "Yeah, just long days." Kyle nodded once. "Take a break. I'll get your paperwork started." The driver looked surprised, then grateful. "Appreciate that, son." Kyle went back inside, heart heavier than before, but in a different way. Not guilt, something closer to clarity. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Brandon drove into the golden light, the sky streaked with orange and violet. His rig rolled steady, tireless as the man behind the wheel. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. He glanced at it briefly. Some people write history, others carry it. "RG." Brandon smiled faintly, gripping the wheel tighter. He didn't reply. No need to. Instead, he let the words settle inside him like dust on steel. History. He never set out to be part of it. Never wanted the weight of memory or the burden of being someone's hero. But somewhere along the way, he'd become both. Miles behind him, the world shifted in subtle ways. At truck stops across the country, drivers spoke his name, not as a legend, but as a reminder of what mattered. At the depot, the new policy, dubbed the McCoy Protocol, ensured that veterans and elderly drivers were fast-tracked through inspections. Their time respected, their experience valued. Even Kyle changed. He stopped enforcing rules without question, started listening more, and listening. And Martin Terrence? He kept driving. Every time he passed through the depot, he made sure to tell the story again. How an old trucker taught him that quitting was easy, but delivering was what mattered. Brandon never heard any of it directly. He didn't seek it out. But sometimes, late at night, when the road was empty and the stars filled the sky, he thought about it. About the past, the men he couldn't save, and about the ones he still could. He thought about the soldier who once believed he could change the world with maps and engines and sheer willpower. And the man who learned that maybe, just maybe, he already had. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills, Brandon shifted gears, pushing forward. The road called him still, not because he had to drive, but because he chose to, because every mile was a promise. Every delivery was a lifeline, and somewhere down the line someone was waiting. So he kept going. This story makes us reflect on what we owe those who came before us, and what happens when we finally see them. What would you do if someone saw past your age, your past, or your mistakes? Comment below. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. See you in the next video.